Hi folks, Glenn Garner here, and this is 24 Hours of Reality, and what we're going to talk about today is a zero emission environment. So we've heard a lot and we've seen a lot around the science of climate change, but we know and experience what reality is. And what reality is that we've been having higher temperatures, maximums broken all over the world. We've seen devastating bushfires in America, Australia. We've seen it across the world. So we know these things, but they're terrifying. And you know what the fossil fuel company does? It fights fear with fear. So they've created this whole speak around loss of jobs, an unreliable energy network, higher costs. But in fact, the story is much, much different. So that's what we're going to talk about today. To describe a zero emission society, I'll break it down into three facets: health, the impact on your wealth or your hip pocket, and public safety. But you could ask the question, how did I become interested in this? Well, that goes back to the end of the 70s, start of the 80s. And I used to work in microwave communication systems, which are those towers on mountain tops. And I'd often come down from a mountain outside Sydney through this little village called Kurrajong. It's about 500 metres above sea level. And this is the view I'd get, a stunning view of the city, but only when the wind is from the west. When it wasn't, you'd get a view like this. Sydney Basin is a bowl, and it has, to the north and south, lips that are about 200 metres high. So from Kurrajong at 500 metres, you'd see over the top of that. And then as you went down the mountain, you'd see this. You'd be right in line with the smog. And then what I'd do, I'd take a big breath. I'd hold it until I got down as far as I can. And I'd think, oh, just a little bit more fresh air I've been able to save in my lungs. Now that got me thinking, what is the impact on the body? And what is the impact on society in general? And is this common across many, many towns and cities across Australia and across the world? So that took me on a path. Now fast forward that about 20 years from then, and we're now at the end of the 90s, start of 2000. And someone said to me, what's your legacy? And I really didn't understand that at first. I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, what will you leave behind? What will you be remembered by? You talk about the impact on society of smog, and you're very active about that. But what have you actually done about it? And so from then on, I changed from an executive position in a US multinational to leaning back into my engineering roots and working with energy providers to provide renewable energy and start to eliminate this smog. So I've got a history of understanding both the impact and the solution. We're going to have to look at a few aspects. And if we look at climate change as a whole and greenhouse gas emissions, they certainly are right around the world, and they take a while to mitigate once we start our action. But there's something much closer to home, right at your house, at your town, at your city, and it's particulate matter and it's photochemical smog, and it's the energy facilities that are near you and the trucks and cars that go up and down your street. Before COVID, we had two cities here that you see. One is Delhi on the top left-hand corner, and on the top right-hand corner we have Tiananmen Square, Beijing, China. What happened as soon as COVID happened and they started to reduce oil and coal burning, the particulates dropped 70% in 1 week. And this is what you got as a result. So we know that as soon as you take action, there's results locally, in your house, in your town, in your city. So this is a benefit to you. And it's not so much a global exercise because particulates are local. What do these particulates actually do to the body? On the lungs and on the circulatory system. Now I'm going to talk about particulate matter two ways. PM10, which is 10 microns and down in size, and 10 microns, you get particles at that size. About 4 of them fit width-wise in a human hair, so they're awfully small. And then I'm going to talk about PM 2.5 microns, which is even smaller. Now the PM 10, at the best, cause coughing and wheezing. At the worst, it's asthma, bronchitis, and emphysema. Dire lung problems. At the 2.5 micron level, these particles go right through the lung cell walls and into the blood. They cause high blood pressure, heart attacks, strokes, cancer, as well as other developmental defects and childhood problems. What that does in our society, in Australia, is cause 4,000 premature deaths per year and hospitalises 25,000 people that eventually get out of hospital. But it causes a huge impact to our healthcare system. And this is not paid for by the fossil fuel industry. Early death or hospitalisation, they're terrible, terrible things. And they impact our society tremendously. Now, let me just mention, what is the cost impost on our healthcare system for these deaths and hospitalisations? Well, it's $2.9 billion in Australia to our healthcare system. That's about $116 for every man, woman and child, or about $300 to $400 per family. So, as I talk about that cost impost, the fossil fuel industry doesn't pay. Let me then come to this wealth aspect. So this is just one aspect of the impact on your wallet, on your pocket, in your house, in your town, in your city where you live. To talk about the cost of power, both oil and coal and gas that provide our energy systems, I'm going to take you first through the value chain of a coal-fired power station, just to show you what's involved. Now this is pretty obvious, you probably know it, but let's just take the 5 steps that create power in a coal-fired powered system. We have to dig the coal out of the ground. That's a big exercise. We have to transport it to where we're going to generate the power. We have to wash it down to clear out the dirt, and then it's clean enough to burn, but we have to pulverize it and crush it into a powder before we burn it. We burn it in a coal-fired power station, and actually it just boils water, and that steam from the boiled water turns a steam turbine, and that creates energy. So it's 5 steps to get to energy production. But there is a 6th step. Once we produce the energy, we have to remediate the fly ash, which comes out the back end of the power plant. And of course, the other 2 things that come out of this whole cycle is greenhouse gases, which, as I said, are global issues. They diffuse into the atmosphere. But particulates, which affect lung and heart disease, are fairly local. They're in your country, in your town, in your city. One other thing I must mention. This whole value chain of producing coal-fired power consumes water. Each one of these steps consumes some water, and for a kilowatt of energy, which is about a small air conditioner or a bar heater running for half an hour, a kilowatt hour of energy, up to 15 litres of water. Now we could use that water for potable water for drinking, or we could use it for agriculture. And in a water-starved country like Australia, this is significant. Let's compare this multi-step process to renewable, and you'll see obviously why it's now cheaper. 1-step process for a solar farm. You put the solar farm in place, no cost of source energy. One step, simple, efficient, cheap. Same with wind. No cost for the source energy, which is the wind. It's one step. The wind blows, you generate power. And exactly the same for hydropower. The rain rains into a dam, you capture it, put it through turbines, and you produce energy. Now, these are all one-step processes. Let me also say that the other thing about hydro is instead of dropping it into a river at the bottom of those turbines, you capture it in a dam, and then when you have excess wind and solar, as you do quite often, you pump the water back up to the top dam, and when you have a deficiency in renewable energy, you release it down through the hydro system. It's called pump hydro storage, and it's one of the storage systems with batteries that enable us together to create a renewable energy system. And that system, the levelized cost of wind or solar with storage, is less than coal, and it's less than gas. It's less in Australia, it's less in America, it's less in Europe. The cost has been driven down to such an extent, and you can see it. Simple one-step process. And it doesn't consume water. Even hydro, if you capture it in a dam below and pump back up, doesn't consume water as such. You keep the water and recycle it all the time. Now, land transport is the same kind of issue. It's much cheaper to drive a performance car like a Tesla a kilometre when you charge it with electricity than when you put oil in the tank of a performance car. Now, there's lots of different innovations that are coming in and producing renewable-based energy sources for land transport. But when we move to this, all we've got to do is bring up the volume of these vehicles to bring the cost to purchase a vehicle down, and then the running costs are much lower. And you know what? We won't be held to ransom by OPEC, who artificially contrive the supply and demand of oil to a world market to manipulate the pricing. We will have effectively our own electric oil in country. So these countries right around the world won't be held to ransom like they do with oil, with OPEC, and with gas, with Russia. So from a hip pocket point of view, we've got a lot of advantages moving to a zero emission environment. It's healthier and it's cheaper. I may remind you that as well as the overall cost being cheaper, you get another saving of that 2.9 billion that's pushed into our healthcare system for the health impacts that it has. The next question, I guess, is around safety, and I'm going to cover this in two ways. I'm going to cover it in terms of resiliency, and I'm going to cover it in terms of other oil impacts. Now, I mentioned that we distribute renewable energy and storage right across the grid. And in fact, if you look at, say, the east coast of Australia, you've got all the way from Queensland to Tasmania, and you've got elements of storage rather than large centralised power supplies. This increases the resiliency and the reliability of the grid, not what the fossil fuel industry is saying. It becomes less reliable. That's actually a misnomer. In fact, one of the things they love to say, which just makes me laugh, is that the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. But guess what? If you look at that east coast of Australia, the wind is always blowing somewhere, just not in one particular place. And on any one day during the day, the sun is always shining somewhere. So when you distribute your assets across a wide region, you get a highly reliable, highly resilient system. And the misinformation spread by the fossil fuel industry just doesn't bear standing up to any scientific facts. Now, the oil industry, we know this is Deepwater Horizon, and we've all heard of Deepwater Horizon. We've also heard of Exxon Valdez. For the last 100 years, when we've produced oil, we have explosions and spillages, and we haven't gotten rid of those. In fact, to demonstrate that, I've got a little chart here where I put the major oil spillages between March this year and August, and they're everywhere, right across the world. Tens of thousands of tons of oil spill, all polluting our oceans and our air. Now, we don't need that, and as soon as we move to a zero emissions environment, we move away from that. So, a zero emissions future is certainly a much better life. Well, I mentioned coming down from Kurrajong. I'd love to go back to Sydney in 2030 and think that I could drive over the top of the mountain at Kurrajong, look down into the Sydney Basin and see no smog, no soup in the air. And it's possible. As I showed you, the action you take today within weeks will clean up the air. So we need to certainly rush towards that zero emissions future and have a healthier, wealthier and safer life. It's pretty amazing at the misinformation that the fossil fuel companies have been able to spread about what our future life is like. Job losses, higher cost of energy, unreliable grid. You know, I hope I've demonstrated today the logic of what really is going to happen, and that is a much better life for us all. So, as I say, we need to rush towards a zero carbon environment. Zero fossil fuel emissions will give us a much, much better life, and it's a much better place to be. Thank you.